999 indictments against him, an insurrection that he arguably led back in 2020, and a fear that he is closer to Putin than NATO. Yet it is the issue of abortion that may, just may, derail Donald Trump's presidential candidacy. What is the state of the Biden-Trump race at the moment? Closer to home, the local election campaigns are well underway. But what state is local government in England in? And the Angela Rayner saga has gone to another level this week. How much trouble is Labour's deputy leader really facing? Welcome to the latest Downtown Den Politics podcast.
Just a sort of bigoted woman.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
Okay, so I'm delighted to be joined by Martin Liptrot, our American correspondent. Martin, joining us live. He's flown back into the UK. I think you're going to be with us for a couple of months, Martin. Is that right?
I'm leaving Florida for the summer to enjoy the delights of the world. Yeah. People are taking my temperature as we speak.
Yeah, and I'm afraid as you came into the Downtown Den, people were blaming you for this awful weather that we're having. But as you pointed out, it wasn't that great before you landed.
Exactly. It's a continuum. Exactly.
So we'll go into, the madness of Martin in terms of return at this point in time in a moment. But the obvious reason that we wanted to get you in to discuss politics. It's the presidential election this year, of course, and everybody has a keen eye on what's happening in the States because it's such an important player in terms of geopolitics. And of course, we in the UK think that we have this special relationship with America. You have, I think, different views on that, but nevertheless, it's still seen as a big, big election and everybody takes an interest in it. I think if you just said even 2 years ago that Donald Trump was going to be favoured to win the presidency in 2024, people would have doubted that being the case. He'd lost midterm elections quite badly. This new guy on the block called DeSantis seemed to have some momentum behind him. But of course, over the past 24 months, that's all changed. And the Don is back. So how do you see the state of play at the moment in terms of that presidential race between Trump and Biden?
Well, I'll tell you what, Frank, he never went away. And that's the reality. Whilst Trump is unpopular with the elite of the Republican Party, hated by the Democrats, despised by Hollywood and the wokerati, as they're called in America, to a lot of Americans, he's the best option out there still, and has been since his defeat in the 2020 election. That power outside of the mainstream party never went away. And what Trump's been very successful at doing is putting that coalition back together again, and is now, barring a health issue or a further left field political legal scandal, it will be on the ticket. And we'll win.
You think?
As it stands. Two things have happened that might change that in the last 48 hours. First one, of course, is the situation between Iran and Israel. Americans are, of all political persuasions, are very aware of their place on the world stage and the important role that America has in protecting our allies and defending the kind of rule of law that we all recognise and support. Trump does not have that capability in his makeup. He's not a world leader. He's not a world player. He doesn't build a coalition anywhere. His reaction overnight from the US was to reissue his all capitals tweet on his own. He uses Truth Social now. He's got his own platform. All capitals tweet that just effectively, called the Iranian leadership names. Just a big big swear. It wasn't sweary, but it was effectively an FU in capitals. And whilst that probably appeals to a certain electorate in the US, it doesn't look statesmanly. It doesn't look like the kind of person who's going to bring all the parties you need to bring together. But Biden's much better at doing that. So when people are looking at the situation from a world stage perspective, I think you start to think, well, hang on, maybe Donald's not the man. The second thing is the polls have come in. We had polls done second week of April, so 7th of April. For the first time in a long time, Biden made ground. Biden's outspending Trump 10-1. Trump hasn't got any money, and any money he has got is going towards paying for his legal problems. There's all kinds of arm's length businesses being set up to not get trapped by electoral law. But Biden's outspending 10-1 at least, and running more events and using online, partly because he's not a particularly strong rally kind of guy, but they're putting half decent social media together for him. So the polls ran, and in the 7 swing states, the 7 states that matter, and in 6 of them, he either closed the gap or took a marginal lead. And that's the first time since in the last few months that we've started to see and the polls indicate that there's a swing back in his favour. So it's tight. Trump's ahead. I think the polling showed 47-43 in Trump's favour. But when you looked at some of those swing states, it was 44-43, 45-44, much closer.
Much closer.
So we'll see where we go.
And you mentioned that coalition that he's managed to build. And of course, an important part of that is the evangelical movements in the States, which is huge. And therefore, this abortion issue, which has reared its head in recent months, is starting to create some problems for him domestically. We'll come back to the international piece shortly. But there was this big ruling, Wade versus Roe, which then totally reopened the abortion debate in the States to the point now where you have individual states revisiting the issue. And I think it's fair to say the vast majority of women, certainly not all of them, of course, but the vast majority of women absolutely up in arms at some of the decisions that are being made. I think in Arizona, it's now virtually impossible to have an abortion without you potentially being locked up. And worse, the people who carry out the procedure being locked up.
Yeah. So a couple of things there. Roe versus Wade took the federal government out of the decision. And what you have to remember about America is it's the United States of America. And actually the way the Constitution is structured and the way that the law works, the states are the powerful partners here. Trump's latest announcement was that he didn't think it was a federal issue. He thinks it should be left to each individual state. Arizona found a law from 1861, written during the Civil War, that they have now put back onto the statute book, which, as you said, effectively, in almost every circumstance, forbids abortions. You also mentioned the coalition that Trump has built. The one area where Trump was at his weakest and still is white women. They were the largest group that voted against Trump in the last elections. And this is an issue that clearly, for many women of colour as well as white women, is troubling. So I think he's on very, very dangerous ground there. And it's also an issue where damned if you do and damned if you don't. From people who believe in free access to reproductive rights for women, he's never going to be popular. But then there's also the very strong evangelical movement who wants it at a federal level to be outlawed, and he's not meeting their expectations. I think his latest announcement that leave it to the states is a smart cop-out. It kind of takes him a little bit out of the picture, and he can shrug and say, well, that's for your governor in Arizona to to determine for you. But it is definitely the issue that is working against him. Biden's people have identified that. A lot of what he is talking about, what Biden is talking about, touches on these issues and the rights that surround these issues. Is that enough to win an election? I don't know. There's a lot of nostalgia for the economy under Donald. People are, thinking back, this interest rates used to be low, my mortgage was less, cost of living wasn't quite as bad. Now, whether that was Trumpism or anything slightly to do with him, there's another discussion. But we just remember those times. And his party and his people are fueling that kind of false nostalgia, really.
And yet, by international standards, the state's economy is performing well. And Biden will point to some very radical measures that he would say, this is why America is doing so well economically. Give me some credit. Why isn't he getting that credit, Martin?
Well, first of all, I think if you ask a majority of Americans, are they happy with the two candidates on the ticket, they'd say no. It's a bit Hobson's choice, really.
Yeah.
And the person who will win...
Corbyn against May.
It is. The person who will win will be the person least disliked, which is never a great way to go in an election. I like Joe Biden. I think he's a serious and sensible politician, but he's well past his best.
Yes.
The other fella is a little bit scary. And I think, as I was saying earlier about that Israel situation at the moment, you do start to question whether this is somebody you want anywhere near that table. The economy is doing okay, but the economy and the stock market are different things.
Yes. Yeah.
So people don't feel the security of a solid economy just because the Magnificent Seven stocks are all, gangbusting up there and doing phenomenally well and putting 80% gains this year on. Great for the wealthy who own stocks and shares, and house prices are stable. Great for them. They own the assets. They call it the asset economy now. If you own stuff, you're okay. If you don't, you're snookered. And that's the reality of life in America at the moment. So people have had a cost of living hit. The mortgages have gone up. The car payments have gone up. All the things that matter to us.
Gas, is that still high? Because
yes,
that is a real... it is in the UK, but in the States, the price at the pump is a big issue, isn't it? A big political issue.
Yeah, and it changes by state again. So you pay $7 a gallon, a US gallon, slightly smaller than an imperial gallon, $7 a gallon in California, and I pay $3.14 where I live in North Florida. So big deviance there on that. But that's because there's local authorities have tax raising powers in America and can make big decisions and spend money on things that matter. So I guess you get an upside to paying a bit more for your fuel. But Biden's economic success isn't really trickling down to being felt in the pocketbook and the purse of regular American households. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge that he faces at the moment.
Now, in terms of the geopolitics, you mentioned that across parties, generally speaking, there is a recognition that the States needs to stay close to NATO. It has traditional allies, and therefore you would expect support to come from the United States, certainly for Israel. And yet, the wheels have come off in terms of the Ukrainian support that America was given. Biden's been trying to get this package, this big package of financial and military support over to Zelensky, and he's not been able to get it through the Senate, is it? Or is it the House of Representatives? Or is it both?
Congress in general.
So what's the story there? Because again, from the outside looking in, it seems that Trump is saying to his people within the Senate don't back that deal. Is that what's happened?
I think that's pretty much exactly what's happened. So again, the misconception is that the president is all powerful and points at things and people do things and they happen. And that's just not the case. Again, the way the Constitution is written, Congress is in charge. And yes, the president has a veto and an important role to play. But if you can't get a piece of legislation through both houses of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, it fails. And that's where we're at the moment. We've got Republican-dominated Congress. Senate is slightly more favourable, but only needs one or two to not fall in line, as we saw last year. And then you also have the phenomenon of absolutely mega legislation. So you never get a single bill, well, very rarely do you get a single bill that's about an issue, concisely written, passes. It always has pork barrels. It always has things added onto it to soften and sweeten it. So you're finishing up where you've gotten the case you just mentioned there of military support for an ally against a foe, Russia, having to have language about the southern border and immigration added into it, having economic spending restrictions written into it, talking elements of that bill have debt repayments and deficit reduction written into it. So these are multifaceted pieces of complex legislation. And of course they stall because it only needs one little bit that doesn't sit comfortably with the representative from Arizona or the senator from New Hampshire, and the wheels can come off. So getting things done in the States when you've got splits in power between the parties in Congress, it is very, very difficult. Very difficult indeed.
Do you think that Ukrainian issue will be resolved anytime soon?
It's a disgrace. I say us as America. It's a disgrace that we don't have a mechanism that we can step up and stand up and send both the humanitarian, the military, and the economic and political support to our allies when it's needed, and that we have to go on a dance through, politicians, the last people you want involved in this, right? Trying to score points, making speeches and trying to polish their buttons for future elections. Get out of the way. This is an issue of state. And the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defence, with the President's blessing, should be able to get on with it and get it done. So there's going to be a lot of discussion about fixing those challenges. If China invades Taiwan, you don't want to have to go and appease Marjorie Greens of the world and others. You want to be able to take action and get it resolved. And this Iranian-Israel challenge that we're facing at the moment is probably one that might move the needle on that.
Because, again, I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that American people, the electorate, generally speaking, are far more concerned about domestic issues. And probably since Barack Obama, actually, there has been a withdrawal from the world stage by America. And I don't mean they're not interested in geopolitics. They don't want to continue to be seen as a big player and have influence. But presidents have to be mindful of what's important to the people who put them in the White House. And the things that matter to Americans at the moment seem, to me at least, to be the price of petrol, the cost of living crisis, whether or not America is dealing with immigration properly. And that's, forgive the pun, but that's trumping those world issues. If you think back to when I was first involved in politics, sort of early 80s, Reagan would spend, hours and hours talking about the threat from Russia and the threat from communism and Reds under the bed, all that sort of stuff. That narrative seems to have gone. Trump stands up and says, I'll just go and do a deal with Putin, which means most people assume, I'll just let him have Crimea. And if he wants to have a little bit more of Ukraine, that's fine. And he'll tell Zelensky, get back in your box.
It's you make a good point. The politics has gone out of politics. So the ideology of political parties, and I would say not just in America, but broadly, has weakened or softened or been diluted to some degree. the enemy is no longer as clear to us. I think global terrorism changed the thoughts around that. Obviously, the horrific events in 9/11 and others changed the world thinking there again. And also, we've moved into an era, and this is one that I struggle with because I want to see a professionalism in politics, and I want to see a more business-like approach to government. But at the same time, it kind of takes the passion out of it. But your point about what motivates Americans is the same as what motivates Brits and French and Germans and Japanese. You know, you have a hierarchy of needs, don't you? And if you haven't got the money coming in to feed your kids,
it's interesting. You look at all the polls, and they will show you that the support for Ukraine. Saying support for Ukraine, but certainly support for financial help to Ukraine is on the way in the UK. No question about it.
Yeah, because maybe our attention spans get shorter as well.
And people are saying, and it's that thing as well, isn't it? It's horrific when you first see those pictures on the television, same as what's happened in Gaza. The more you see of it, the less impact it has on you. And people have got their own issues and their own problems. But it seems to me that MAGA, Make America Great Again, is actually about a far more sort of parochial America, if I can put it that way.
Well, I think it's partly that, but it's partly feeds off, well, not partly, it in a huge way feeds off the dissatisfaction with politics as normal. You know, Trump came to power in 2016 because he was going to drain the swamp. Yeah, it was an anti-Washington message. It wasn't really a political ideology. It wasn't a manifesto of things he was going to do. It was all shoot from the hip. But the idea was politics doesn't work. It definitely doesn't work for you. And they're all, look at them, they're all rich and happy and we're not. And it fed into that. And it was still in that cycle a little bit. It was still in that cycle.
Yeah. And, you know, like most populist parties, Trump doesn't really have policies, does he? Do you think he's sort of got headline sound bites? You know, I'll cut your taxes. I'll give you American jobs for American people. I'll stop immigration. He never really builds a wall, but he never really tells you how he's going to do that. He doesn't have processes in place, doesn't have mechanisms. And the last point we'll make on this before we go to a break and we'll come back home to discuss some domestic politics. Do you think that a second Trump term could be a bit scarier on the basis that the people around him are not necessarily going to be experienced? They're not going to be able to pull him back from his worst excesses because, again, all of the stories that we hear from Trump term one was that there were people in the room who were saying, well, come on, Don. You know, you can't really be expecting people to inject bleach into themselves to get over COVID, for example.
Well, yes. Not a bad example. Okay, so here's something that is interesting about the Trump campaign right now is he hasn't got a VP on board. Yes. So Biden's got Kamala Harris, and she is not helping the picture of, you know, passionate competence. You know, she's a very capable politician, but she hasn't got profile and hasn't really, you know, set the world alight in this first term. There's a big battle going on to be Trump's running mate. If you're going to be Trump's running mate, you've got to have a couple of things front and center. First is he is going to belittle you and ridicule you and point at you and shout at you publicly. And you have to smile and be loyal and take that on the chin. And not everyone, especially politicians, are built that way. Secondly, you have to think he's really unpopular with the elite and the GOP, the Republican Party. Am I doing myself a disservice for the future by being on his ticket today? So there's a fellow called Tim Scott, who's African-American congressman from South Carolina.
Ran himself, didn't he, in the early stages?
Put himself in
for the Republican ticket.
Didn't raise much money, and that's fatal. He's getting talked up because he can bring a black vote, both African American and Hispanic votes, with him, which of course Trump is very keen to put his arms around because there was distance the last time. So he may think, probably haven't got a decent shout of being the Republicans' choice for the next one. This might be my moment. So a lot of people are watching him and saying, Ron DeSantis, as you said earlier, was meant to be the bright new thing. Trump light, Trump 2.0, he was badging himself as initially. Trump just took him apart, and ridiculed him. So it would just look, and he's from Florida, so he's our governor. It would just look very sad, in my opinion, if he was to sign up for the ticket after all that was said and done. But you do hope that somebody gets on that ticket who's going to have a sensible voice. John Bolton, who was Trump's security advisor in the first term, came out yesterday and said Trump doesn't know what he's doing on international affairs and shouldn't be let anywhere near a microphone or on the issues. So there's a lot of people out there who are very, very nervous about it. But Trump will appoint people that he wants to be loyal to him. Put his family into these spots.
Yeah. And that seems to be a shift, doesn't it, from where he was in the first term, where he appeared to be self-aware in terms of his lack of experience in politics. And I suppose, like anyone else, he's thinking, well, I've done 4 years in the White House, wasn't able to do everything I wanted to, and it was their fault. And I'm thinking of people like Mike Pence, like Bolton, there's other people, isn't there, who he's fallen out with massively, who worked for him during that period of time. So this time, as I say, he could surround himself with yes men and women, and that, I think, is what sort of
I think that's the fear. The fear is that there's no mechanism. So in the way that that Congress can positively impact legislation, positively impact decision making on a global and a domestic scale, if Congress hasn't got that power, and the people who are heading up the big departments of state are journeymen for Trump, you do have some concerns there. You do have some concerns. The president's role is a bit like a chief executive's role.
Yeah,
his sets the course and sets the direction, and then should let people get on with it. If your chief executive doesn't set a course and clearly express what the expectations are, people stray off track a little bit. Yeah. And that's the fear that there isn't, in the past, perhaps political parties had that ethos, they had that ideology again, that big ideal that they clung to that kept everybody moving in the same direction. Trump doesn't have that. He's not driven by that at all. This is about him, cult of personality, him being seen and appreciated as the big man that he wants to be seen as.
Well, we're still over 6 months before we get to that fateful election day in November, so I'm sure we'll chat again. But if you're a betting man now, and we're sat here just after the Grand Nationals ran its race down the road in Aintree, my missus won. I didn't. Mine's still running. Where would your money be going?
I've backed Trump from the get-go because I sadly believe that the Democrats are struggling to contest this election properly. I'm hoping that the world affairs that we find ourselves in make people pause and think a little bit about where we get to. Am I allowed an each way bet?
You're going to throw Kennedy's name into it.
Oh, well, I mean, but you well mentioned there. So you've got a third, fourth, and fifth party running this time. The first time we've had, declared candidacy this early outside of the big two, and they may only get. I mean, in the polling I saw, Kennedy was getting up to 7% of the vote, and the others getting single figure, 1% of the votes. That's 9% that could decide an election.
Yeah. Am I making a a wrong assumption in thinking Kennedy's more likely to take Biden votes?
Yeah, he will take Biden votes, and that's the challenge. If Kennedy takes 7%, if he takes the Green, the left wing Green vote from Biden, as there's a Green candidate standing as well, will do. You could lose elections, by handfuls
on the basis
of votes.
of that. Yeah, it is fascinating. It's a fascinating race. I mean, it's not one that I think anybody would particularly want to see. We'd have hoped to have seen two newer, younger, fresher candidates emerge for the biggest democracy in the world to fight over what is still probably the biggest political job in the world, but we are where we are. And as I say, Martin, listen, fascinating to hear your thoughts, and we will be discussing this, no doubt, on at least 2 or 3 more occasions before we get to that November date.
I think there's going to be a big moment when the first criminal court proceedings conclude, and we find out what people really think of having a convicted criminal potentially in the White House. And that changes people's mindsets. Yeah. As I say, fascinating.
Anyway, Donald's not the only one who's in trouble in terms of politics. So Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner, has had her own trials and tribulations to deal with over the past couple of months. We're going to be talking about that and the forthcoming local government elections after this short break. Stay with us. Back in a moment. Hi, I'm Frank McKenna, the Chief Executive and Group Chairman of Downtown in Business, and we are currently taking votes for the City of Liverpool Business Awards, the City of Manchester Business Awards, and the City of Birmingham Business Awards. So if you want to vote for your favourites, please go to our website, all the W's, downtowninbusiness.com, vote for the company or the individual who you think is deserving of a business award in 2024, and find out all the details of how you can get a seat at those 3 great events. So that's the City of Liverpool Business Award on the 4th of July at Sefton Park Palmhouse, and then in the autumn we're at the Lowry for the Manchester event, and we're at Bank, the fantastic restaurant in Birmingham, for the City of Birmingham Business Award. So get voting, get booking your tickets, and we look forward to celebrating with all those fantastic winners when those awards events come around. Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics podcast. I'm delighted to be joined by our Downtown American correspondent, Martin Liptrot, today. We've gone through the American presidential elections and his thoughts on that. And now we're going to turn our attention to domestic issues. You will note the continued absence of triple lock Jim Hancock, enjoying his pension increase. I don't know where he's sunning himself this week, but he's taking a bloody hell of a vacation. Wherever you are, Jim, I hope you're having a great time. And I am promised that he will be back next week. So we look forward to catching up with Jim. And of course, what Jim will be, I'm sure, reading about this moment in time, because he is obsessive about politics in the UK, Martin, will be the forthcoming local election campaigns on the 2nd of May. It was interesting to hear what you said in the first part of the programme, and this huge difference in terms of powers that states have in America and local councils, local authorities, even combined authorities and mayors have in the UK, because we're so dominated by Westminster politics here still, aren't we?
And party politics. Perhaps having spent so long living in the US, I've got a fresh perspective on local government, but I'm underwhelmed by local government in the United Kingdom. I think back to when I was last working over this side and we were in the discussions about devolution. We obviously at a regional level, city regions got the powers. Mayors were created. Combined authorities, were created, and all the infrastructure for that was put in place. But I'm struggling really to declare that a success. I still listen with fond attention to the conversations going on at city level, and it's trapped in the politics of the old. It's party politics, and in a city like Liverpool, where we are today, not a one-party state, but as near as dang it. Yeah, it's rivalries and aspirations of politicians rather than the politics, and that to me is troubling. I think it's partly because you just don't have the ability to get things done at a local level in the UK still. So you've built the political structures of mayors, regional assemblies, whatever, but then they don't have taxing powers. They don't have spending powers. They don't have complete control over the things that matter to people in their lives. And you contrast that with where I'm living at the moment in the States. We've got a federal government, of course. We've got state, city, and county representation. And you feel a lot closer to that. And you expect and demand more delivery from your elected representatives, down to voting for your sheriff, than you ever do here, where it just feels like the old party loyalties trump everything else.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that when we talk about the local elections, it's always against the backdrop of the impact that's going to have on the respective party leaders nationally. So people are saying if there's bad local election results, Rishi Sunak is going to face another backlash amongst his backbenchers. It's not a case of, well, the Labour Party is then going to be able to really influence the national agenda through local government, because, as you say, local government simply doesn't have that power. And yet, the expectation still of local government is that it is influential and it should be delivering more. So when I talk to our members in Liverpool, for example, they're frustrated that Liverpool hasn't seen the sort of investments in regeneration that we've had down the road in Manchester. You go to Birmingham, Birmingham's gone bust as a local authority, and yet the city is still doing very well. It's still thriving. We had Kevin Johnson on the podcast last week who was saying, the whole place feels though it's got a real buzz about it. So there's a mismatch, isn't there, in a sense, in terms of what our expectation of local government is, what it can actually deliver. And then, as I say, the national narrative within the media, at least, is very much, well, what impact are the results going to have on Rishi and Keir?
Yeah, so deal with the second part of that first. So the local election results generally just serve as a proxy for what could happen nationally, particularly where we are in the electoral cycle today, where we know there's an election coming. It's going to be the last Thursday of November. I can confidently predict that. So there's no way that Sunak is going to hold out until the last days of January to be dragged to the polls kicking and screaming. So back end of November. And this is, May 2nd is going to be an opportunity for a proxy vote to say, if these votes were repeated, this is what the election looks like. I understand why that happens, and it makes sense. It's interesting. It's a pretty responsible tallying poll to use, so I like that. Of course, it's got nothing to do at all with the challenge of running local authorities, because local authorities have a huge set of mandates that they must deliver. And that's really all they're empowered to do, because they haven't got, with one or two exceptions, they haven't got the resources to go into electives, things that they would like to do or want to do or aspire to do. Everybody is probably going to have to trim, everybody being local authorities, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 million pounds off their budgets this year, but still these compulsory mandates of performance are in place. So any like-to-dos just get left behind. And that's the sad state of affairs. You could almost argue that the delivery of those compulsory mandatory services get taken away from local authority control and put into different institutions. Because at the end of the day, aged care, the care for vulnerable people in the community, children's services, emptying the bins, tidying up the parks and gardens, filling the potholes, the stuff that people generally expect quid pro quo council tax to be covering goes on and on and on and on, and doesn't need the interference of politics whatsoever. It needs professionalism. It needs organisations that aren't swinging in the wind depending upon the colour of the political party that's in favour. They need to just get on with doing that. So I think if you're going to break down the delivery of those services to super local levels, get them out of local politics completely. And it's revolutionary. I know here I am flying in from the States where things work reasonably well and espousing the complete overturn of local government. But I think it's important that the areas where local government can still play a part and where organisations like yours and the business community writ large can get more engaged is around regeneration and economic development. You know, I am part of a team of people who run a business in the States called Incubate, number 8. Cool, huh? And that's what we do. You know, we put together the opportunity to bring business ideas forwards with the authorities that have both the resource and the ability to deliver. And I think one of the challenges here is there's a lot of talk, but there's not a lot of delivery, partly because it's restricted by absence of funds, partly because it isn't a power that authorities have. Things like MIPIM, the Property Forum and the Investment Forum, lots of good ideas, but I would imagine that less than 1% of those ideas and concepts that are floated really make it to delivery, or on-time delivery at least. Why is that? What is stopping this? So again, back in when I was working over this side, I worked in local government, supporting them as a consultant, helping them set up growth companies and entities that were going to try and drive forwards economic regeneration. And that, you know, in my home borough, the Wirral, it's been successful. They got a growth company up. They found a great private sector partner to tally up with, and they've gone ahead with developing land and building buildings and putting things in place. The thing that I was working hardest on in that was changing the argument and changing the mindset and changing the discussion, that councils weren't just about limiting planning applications or, you know, tinkering at the fringes of things, but should be front and centre of those conversations. And I'd love to see somewhere, somehow, that take root and local authorities have the resources to be commercial and to take things up. Housing's a good example there. We all recognise the need for more housing. We all recognise the lack of affordability. You've got a situation where there are big developers and big house builders who monopolise the industry. We've got to find ways to make it easier for other players to enter the market, to improve quality, competition, drive prices down. The market has got a role to play in making that happen. And local authorities' challenge should be to facilitate that. So I'd love to see fora, the kind of things and the events that you're organising and running, and looking forward to attending in the coming days. I'd love to see them create the ideas that have a natural home that local authorities or combined authorities or local government writ large can actually execute and deliver against. It's a frustration of mine seeing how easier it is to get things done in the US and realise that the system set up here are frustrating that, sadly.
I take your point absolutely about the need for a radical shake-up and reform of local government. And we, of course, since we set up 21 years ago, been banging on about greater devolution. I'm still a believer in city mayors, as well as a regional tier of government. I don't think it's an either or, although personalities and politics can get in the way sometimes. But if you look at the West Midlands, for example, I would argue that if Birmingham would have had its own mayor alongside Andy Street, it would have been a much stronger position than it currently is. So it's horses for courses, I suppose. The thing I would say, though, Martin, is that the one thing local government certainly still has is that soft power, convening power, and an ability to bring people together. And I think when people say to me, why is Manchester so successful in comparison to any other provincial city? It's not just we're closer to them, so we probably feel it a bit more keenly. And the footy doesn't help in that regard in terms of the competition. But it is about convening powers. And it's about, I think, a culture and a mindset in Manchester that says we need strong partners and we want to work alongside people on an equal footing. And I think the problem that you have in both Birmingham and Liverpool, actually, is that the public sector still sees itself as the dominant force in these conversations. I'm not necessarily saying they should be the junior partner. On occasion, they definitely ought to be, though, depending on what the project is. But they've certainly got to start to accept that if they want investment, if they want the private sector to get involved genuinely and seriously, then it's at the very least an equal partnership. And that's why, as I say, I think Manchester, through its leadership, has worked far better than any other city in England.
I agree with you. And I think a city the scale of Birmingham or Manchester or even Liverpool, Leeds, you can see the pathway to convening and delivering, because there's an economic scale, there's an economy of scale that makes sense. I'm interested in, those satellite towns and cities on the outskirts of the big metropolitan areas, the Rochdales, Burnleys, the Oldhams of the world. So it's where people live. Yeah? And what's their economic plan? Are they sleepy suburbs of other places, or do they have a plan for themselves? And I think that's where, you have to say the private sector has to take a much more active role in defining what's achievable, and the local authority and public sector partners really focus on the facilitation of that. And that's not, throwing out the ambition of the politicians. That's about them becoming practical in delivery. And, point back to Birkenhead as my hometown, it's acknowledged that it's got to define itself, placemaking, as I think it's badging itself as Liverpool's left bank, which I quite like the sound of. It's acknowledging that it's there.
Good marketing.
Yeah, it's one train stop, one subway stop from city centre Liverpool, but it's got this land and it's got this accessibility and it's got a hinterland across the borough of wealthy people who like to do things and like to invest in things and own assets, and it's trying to reach out to them. So I'd like to see these secondary, tertiary level settlements find a way of telling that story, and because I think that's where you could make huge strides forwards in the well-being of our citizens across the way. Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, London, big cities are always going to have the whip hand when it comes to being able to attract sizable investment and work with the biggest partners available. You've got to be a bit craftier when you're working for a smaller authority and a smaller scale town or city to make that happen.
Yeah. Well, I think that was part of the narrative around the levelling up agenda that Boris Johnson introduced, which as a concept was absolutely spot on, but obviously never ever got delivered. And then the thing that Johnson was absolutely right about, in my opinion, in terms of connecting the country better. And HS2 was the key part of that. Well, Sunak has dissed it. So there you go. So again, listen, I think the local election results, whatever our feelings about local government, how important it should be, will, as we've said today, be a far greater commentary on what's happening nationally. And again, you know, I know this from my own experience. It used to drive us mad. You know, so Lancashire County Council, I felt, obviously, as one of the leading players there, was doing a fantastic job. But you knew that if that electoral cycle fell when it was mid-term Labour government, then you were in trouble. I was very fortunate during the period I took part. We had Thatcher, I think we had Major, and then we had sort of the honeymoon periods of Tony Blair. So 3 victories for us. But we were under no illusion that it wasn't because Lancashire was being well run. It was because nationally, the Labour Party at that particular moment in time was the place people were going to put their tick. And that isn't really where we want local government to be. If we're going to see, you know, that transformation in those areas that you're talking about.
There is an opportunity. There's a big old window opening up here. So I can't see, short of something catastrophic, I can't see Starmer not winning the general election. I think it's, as I say, it's going to be back end of November. You've just seen a Conservative Party reduce taxes by 5% in real terms through the national insurance figures. Now, that 5% narrowed when you look at the thresholds not moving and all the rest of it. But, you know, the national insurance cuts have come down. It was meant to be 13.25%. It's down to 8 now. So, you know, it's a significant money back in people's pockets. The economy's still not great, but it's stabilising. Inflation's coming down. Mortgage rates are going to be much more attractive from a borrowing point of view. And Keir Starmer could inherit this Conservative economic miracle on the first day of his prime ministership. He's got to find a way to double down and invest in that to get things going. What he can't do is start issuing plans that have got 2030, 2040, 2050 timelines on. People aren't going to give him the
No, people don't have time now, do they?
No. So you know, for whether you're a Tory supporter or a Labour voter like us or whatever else, you have to acknowledge the times that you live in, the circumstances you live in, and Starmer may be genuinely lucky that he steps in, not a healthy economy, but one that's recovering. And that he can then double down on helping cities and local authorities and other institutions make the most of those favourable wins.
Now, if we're expecting Keir Starmer to be the Prime Minister, we would expect Angela Rayner to be the Deputy Prime Minister, but she's been caught up in what I think is a rather bizarre row, and one that would inform me as to one of the reasons why people say politics, you can fuck off, because this is a so-called scandal that relates back to, I think I'm right in saying, over 10 years ago. It was when she had 2 homes through personal circumstances, not an unusual thing to happen for people who go through divorces or meet new people or whatever the arrangements were at the time. And the 2 huge charges against her, Martin. One is that she sold a council house. I mean, initially, the fact that she bought a council house was trying to be held up as the hypocritical thing that the Red Queen had done, because, of course, that was a Margaret Thatcher policy back in the day, selling off council house. Anyway, she buys a council house, then sells it off, and there is an allegation that she didn't pay what we believe to be the princely sum of £1,500 in capital gains tax. So that's one issue. Now, she says that she got tax advice at the time, and she is clear as far as she's concerned. The second allegation, which we sort of touched upon last week, Kevin Johnson and I, and said this could be a little trickier, is that she stood for a council seat in Stockport and used that home as an electoral address when her principal residency was with her husband at the time. And that seems to be the issue that has emerged as being the more serious, because that is an electoral offence, and therefore she would be breaking the law of the land. And obviously, if you are wishing to become Deputy Prime Minister for the Labour Party, at least, that is a big deal. That will go look through. It makes me fucking howl when Grant Shapps comes onto the television and starts criticising people's integrity, whoever they are, to be honest, because I think Grant Shapps, I always remember Michael Crick chasing him around a Conservative Party conference, asking him what name he was going by that particular week, because he's had many pseudonyms as Mr. Shapps. Anyway, I digress. So Angela's been caught up in this row, and it has got some momentum, gained some legs, not least because the Daily Mail, who ran this huge campaign against Keir Starmer and something that ended up being called Beergate for months and months and months, had a police investigation reopened, still didn't get anywhere in the end. But here we are again. And I think voters will be looking at this with some indignation and thinking, for God's sake, have we not got better things to talk about? But nonetheless, we know what politics is like. The final thing I'm going to say, and this is something you and I will not be surprised by. The latest revelation is that somebody who once worked for Angela, so another Labour Party member, Martin, would you believe it? A Labour Party member trying to do another Labour Party politician in.
I can't picture this. I can't picture this.
A guy called Matt Finnegan has said, oh, well, I actually, I remember it well from all those years ago. And actually, Angela Rayner was not living in the residency there. So all of this is getting messy. As somebody who has advised politicians like me in the past, what would you be saying to Angela Rayner right now? What would her best course of action be, do you think?
I think what she's done is the right course. So she's fronted it up and said that there's a police investigation, and if she's found to have contravened the law, then she'll step down. You're right in dividing the troubles up into sections. The first one is stuff and nothing. She bought a council house and made a small profit off of it when she sold it on. Nobody cares. Falsifying your documents for electoral reasons is a criminal offence. So that's got to be looked at and proven. If she made the mistake of doing that, then I'm afraid there's consequences to pay. But she's acknowledged that. I don't think anybody out there is giving two hoots, but it does give you an insight into the state of the Conservative mindset. Yeah, that they can see their own leader falling apart in front of them. Sambagate, he's now hated by scallies across the whole country. As long as he doesn't come out in his 115s, Liverpool will be okay. Yeah. So, it's just horrific. Sunak can't do right for doing wrong. And they're saying that. The Daily Mail, which is a vicious rag, is looking for anything that it can kind of, almost in a Trump-esque way, stir up that vitriol. I think the Daily Mail executive hate the idea of Angela Rayner. Yeah. They hate the idea that a girl who got pregnant at 16 and had to leave school without qualifications has made good and got away with it, bettered herself, and is now on the verge of being the deputy leader of the nation. They hate that, that doesn't fit into their kind of morally weird world that they occupy. So this is driven by them. This is about them attacking Angela for having made a success of what were, most of us would say, challenging situations and circumstances. And this is the one that they've hung the hat on. And people will come out of the woodwork for a moment in the sun and say various things and sign certain things. That's politics. Angela hasn't got to where she is today without being able to take the rough and tough tumbles of pre-general election politics. I think we'll all be talking about something different in a week's time. Again, there is a police inquiry and she's done wrong, then there's a consequence there, and she's acknowledged that. But I think we'll have moved on, and we'll be talking about something a little more substantive, hopefully, in the near future.
Yeah, I think that's a great analysis of the way the situation is unfolding. I would say that some consolation perhaps for Angela Rayner is that if she wasn't seen as a genuine threat to the Conservative Party, the Daily Mail, quite frankly, wouldn't give a shit, would they? But she is seen as one of Labour's best performers. Again, I would just rewind the clock back 3 or 4 years, and people were saying to me, Angela Rayner is going to be a real problem for you. You know, as deputy leader, the profile she's going to have. And all of a sudden, people are seeing her as authentic, bright, somebody who's got a bit of fire in the belly, somebody who does talk up for those very people that we were talking about earlier in the conversation, in those provinces, in those towns, those places that do need levelling up, and people can identify with. And all of a sudden, the Tories and the Tory press have seen that as a big problem for them.
I think they remember, this is people from the political world at least, we kind of remember the Prescott Express. Absolutely. Blair, when John Smith passed and Tony Blair stepped up to be leader of the Labour Party, he brought with him that professionalism that the party had been lacking in a campaign sense for a long time. And he definitely appealed to a much broader voting demographic than any Labour leader had previously for a long while. But there was a question in the back of people's minds that what they thought the Labour Party should still stand for had been left behind and forgotten about. Evidently, by the policies that went through, minimum wage, sure starts, all the rest of it, that wasn't true. But the fear of it was there. And Prescott played, as deputy leader, with the Ian McCartneys of the world and others, played a vital role in reaffirming and reassuring trade unionists, party members, public sector employees, that their concerns were still front and centre. And I think Angela's got the same role to some extent. She's got other levelling up agenda is a great example there. It's great that somebody is making sure that those issues are still top of mind, front and centre, when we're going into a new government and potentially, 2 terms perhaps, of making big changes and a big difference to the way we live our lives here. Angela's more than capable of looking after herself. And I think that the police investigation will probably come to naught and we'll all move on.
And you mentioned John Prescott, obviously famously decked one of the electors who threw an egg at him. And I remember getting the phone call actually during that campaign. Anyway, you wouldn't put it past Angela doing the same, and I'd rather get a smack off John Prescott, I have to say. But there you go. Listen, it's been great to have you in the downtown den, Martin. It. And as I say, we will get you back on before that election day in November, the one in the States. But I know you take a keen interest in British politics as well, and enjoy your stay here. I guess that your main priority over the next month or so will be to make sure Everton stays safe, will it?
That and keep me tan topped up.
Well, you'll have to go on sunbeds or get fake tan, mate. But there's plenty of girls in Liverpool who can tell you where the shops are for Saint-Tropez. Anyway, listen, before I get myself into any more trouble with Scouse women, it's been great for you to join us again. I hope you've enjoyed the latest episode of the Downtown Den Politics Podcast. As I said, we'll be back next week with Jim Hancock back in the den. And before then, have a great 7 days. And let's see what unfolds with Sambagate, the Red Queen, and the orange one over in the States.